Okay, so we're going to cover 3 collars in this presentation. Okay, so we're going to do a basic wrapped collar. We're going to do a basic wrapped. We're going to do an incised collar. We're going to do a forged collar with upset corners so that these corners come to a true square as opposed to rolling off like this. And I just want to say that for this particular presentation, this is geared towards level 2. So there are other collars which you could opt to do, but for the scope of level 2, we don't need to really cover those. The materials and tools. You're going to need your hand hammer, whatever you're comfortable with. I would recommend a mallet. You could use a wooden mallet, but I prefer rawhide. I like a set hammer when I'm setting some of my collars. And I like a set hammer that has a good radius on the edge so that I don't mark my collars as I'm going. You probably are going to have some collaring jigs and collaring vices, and we'll talk a little bit about those. If you're going to make test elements to test your measurements on your collars and your entire process with your collars to make sure that they truly actually fit the element that you're trying to collar, you probably want to do some bending jigs so you can make sort of scroll fragments to do test elements on. You'll need a scrolling wrench for that if you really want to do that. That makes it the easiest. You'll have to have tongs for all sizes of your stock, and if you're going to be doing a forged collar, you're probably going to want to have a pair of scrolling tongs to open your collar up. After you've forged the corners in, you're going to want to have a pair of bolt tongs, like V-bit tongs, that you can close the collar back up onto your element. After you've opened it up, heated it, put it on the element, you want to have some way to close it. A pair of V-bits works really well. I used a pair of 5/8 in my videos. For your materials, you're going to want to have 3/8 by 3/4. All of these are 1/4 inch wide stock. You're going to have 3/8 by 3/4 for your scroll elements. You're going to have 3/16 by 3/4 for your plain or basic collar and your incised collar. And for your forged collar, you're going to have 1/4 by 3/4. Now, the extra 1/16 of an inch counts for forging down your corners, and it will ultimately end up at about 3/16 by the time you're done. So measuring for collars, you're going to have, we're going to cover the 3 types. Now, the thing about this is that they all essentially have the same elements or the same measurements, because essentially they're all going to end up as a 3/16 by 3/4 wrap. You start with the basic one. If you want to have forged collars, you have to account for the extra addition of stock to account for these corners. If you're going to do an overlap, then the measuring is slightly different, but the amount of actual stock in there is more or less the same. The measurement is more or less the same, I should say. So the basic formula is that you take the perimeter of your total bundle of stock. In this case, you have you'll notice that I have a different layout than the Abana layout. I'm using my CBA layout. When I talk about a bundle, I also am using the old 3/8 by 3/4 scroll elements that are prior to Russ doing some updated plans for that, where we've scaled this down to be 1/4 by 3/4. It really doesn't matter for the purpose of discussion and learning how to collar. You just need to know what you're actually using. In this case, I used 3/8 by 3/4. And when you've doubled that up with 2 scroll elements, you basically end up with 3/8 plus 3/8 is 3/4 by 3/4. You end up with a cross sections that it's about 3/4 square. So your perimeter is 3/4 on all sides. That gives you 1.5 inches if you add up all sides. Or if you add up, it ends up 3 inches if you add up all sides. And then the 2.5 depends on your thickness of your collaring stock. So you have your perimeter is for your scroll elements, and then the stock thickness here is for the collaring stock. So the total perimeter of your bundle of scroll elements is 3 inches. And then if you take 3/16, we'll do 2.5. So 3/16 times 2 is 3/8. And then add a 0.5, it ends up in a sort of a middle ground between a 16th and an 1/8. Well, in collaring, this is one area where I would kind of err on the side of doing a smaller measurement. The reason why I would say that is because if you end up with a smaller measurement than is desired, you'll have a collar that completely wraps your bundle and will hold it with a good closure. And you maybe have a little bit of an unsightly gap. But on the other end of that, if you end up with a collar that is too big, then it will enclose the entire junction of your elements here, but it will be so big or too big to where it'll want to rock and rattle around. So let's just call this, we have 3 for the perimeter plus 3/8. And I'm going to say that extra little bit, we'll call it a 16th. So 7/16 is what I'm going to take for my measurements. Now, that's what I'm going to take as a starting point, but you want to do a stock calculation. And then at that point, everything kind of matters. It's all dependent on your particular forging style. You might forge a little bit differently than me. You might have a slightly different reference point when you're doing your cutting. There's all kinds of different variables. So that calculation, that serves as a starting point. And then from there, you want to make these test pieces, which are basically 2 very, sort of generic, C scroll sort of bends. And you want to take your measurements and you want to do an application on a test element, a fragment like I have here. Then you want to make your observation and take really good notes. So what I might, cut, I might cut 3 3/8, and you might cut 3 5/8 according to how you're doing it. Or maybe you do 3 7/16. The point is that you know what you're doing and you can reproduce that so that when you go and you actually apply this to your grill, your measurement comes up right. And the number is not really important. What matters is that you end up with a collar that has a good closure, where it doesn't have a big gap, and it also doesn't want to wobble and wiggle and jiggle around. So we'll talk a little bit more about the slight variations on each type after we've gotten to each particular type. So you have to choose, what are you going to do? Are you going to do butted, or are you going to do overlapped? It's really your choice how you want to go with that. And it really comes down to preference. Now, the forged collars with a square corner, it's not an option. You have to have a butted end. And the reason why is because you're upsetting your corners. And if you have an overlap, you won't have any support underneath the corners that you're trying to upset. It will be shearing and slipping, and you won't be able to get 2 of your corners to be an upset square corner. So it's not an option if you're going to opt to do this square corner. The butted collars are very much in an English style of work, and the overlapped collars are in a Germanic style of work. And that just adds historic context. Really, it comes down to your preference. What do you like? At the end of the day, what we're asking for you to do at this level of work is to just be able to measure and apply a collar correctly. So you don't have to do any of these optional variants. You can just do your basic wrapped collar, and that's completely satisfactory for a level 2. So if you want to do a forged collar, beaded collars, which is beyond the scope of even level 2, it's into level 3, but I add it because some of the old plans have a beaded collar that has 3 lobes on it, has 3 individual beads. And when I did my level 2, that was what was shown on the plan, so that's what I did. But if you want to do a forged collar, a beaded collar, an overlapped collar, or one with upset corners that are I guess I already covered that. Those are all more challenging than a basic butted collar, and it really comes down to, how much do you want to challenge yourself for this particular project, because this is really a matter of your personal growth and your personal goals. So we ask that you do a collar well applied, and that's a basic collar. But all of these, if you want to challenge yourself, they're all on the table. You just need to understand that if you want to challenge yourself to do that, and then you're going to be graded by an evaluator, they're going to judge the collar that you applied. So you can challenge yourself and make it harder, but if you do a fancier collar, it's not going to impress the judge unless it's done well. And it certainly won't pass unless it passes all of the criteria for passing, which is that it is well fit without large gaps and it doesn't wiggle. So just something to think about. So I want to cover some tooling. You have different ways that you can do this. I, in my videos, used these, what you call a jig and a mandrel, and I've seen different arrangements of this. This is the one that Mark Asprey has in his book. I really like using Mark Asprey's books because he's got the books, and it's something that as a student you can go back and you can reference against after one of these talks, and you can have that discussion that we're having right now is now supported by something in text that you can go and you can reference against to refresh your memory. So I used the jig and mandrel, but realistically, there's multiple ways that you could do this. You can use a spring vise, which I'll show in a minute. And you could even use just a block of steel that is the size of your entire bundle. In this case, we have 3/8 by 3/4 doubled, so 3/4 square. And you could take a piece of 3/4 inch square stock, and you can make your staple form just with a piece of the stock in a vise, and just make your basic staple form in that in the vise using just a piece of square stock. But these are nice because you can get the job done a lot more easily and a lot more uniformly if you want to do that. So the ones that I made out of 1/2 by 2, and I cut some 2-inch long sections to make these upright sections here, and then I radius those to a big, generous sort of 1/2 inch radius. These stops along the back, I just used some 3/8 inch square stock that spanned the whole thing. Now, this is in Mark Asprey's second book, the red book on traditional joinery, all supported by the work that he does. So if you have the books, if you want to reference back, you can see how these are put together. You'll notice that there are 2 different sizes. I have a size fit for the 3/16 stock, and I have a size fit for the 1/4 inch stock. And I really do like the option here of using a piece of angle iron. I used some light gauge angle iron that just exceeded the size of my hardy hole. My weld is on the inside of the angle. This is something that Mark showed me for when I was doing traveling like lessons, and I didn't know what anvils I'm using. Well, if you have a piece of angle iron, it's really easy to grind off one edge or each edge and get it to fit any hardy hole that you want. So that applies to your own home shop. And when you weld on the inside of an angle iron, it doesn't intrude over the edge of your hardy hole. It's a real easy way to fabricate up hardy tools, not just the ones that are being shown. So we'll just, real quick, let's talk about how these are set up. You have this piece of 3/4 inch square is basically a driver that is representing your bundle of your scroll elements, but you could build this up over multiple pieces. You could do 2 pieces of 3/8 inch square, folded over or welded together. And if you have multiple sections of scroll elements like you do on the level 3, you could weld those entire bundles up together, and that would be the side, the edge that's driving down into the driver, and then you just need a pad to hammer on. And then the measurements here are your total stock thickness of your bundle plus your collar doubled. So let's talk about what that is. You have 3/8 by 3/4 in this presentation doubled, so that gives you 3/4 wide. And on this one, you take the 3/16 and the 3/16 and add that to the 3/4, so you're going to end up with 1 inch and 1/16. You're going to add a shim of cardstock to add a little bit for thermal expansion, and then you put the cardstock in with the rest of the bundle. Really just take everything that's going to be in that whole bundle and clamp them between your 2 uprights plus a piece of cardstock, and then weld them together. You're good to go. You have this piece across the back. You do 1 piece across the back for alignment, and then when you're done, you cut with a cutting disc, like for an angle grinder. You use a cutoff wheel and just cut that out so you have clearance for your driver. I want to mention that this weld on the edge gave me some trouble. You'll see it in my video, so you want to probably grind that flush. Your driver, you also want to really radius this bottom edge, and I'll show you why in the video that's to come. You could use a collaring vise like this to hold the collaring and the entire bundle plus the collar together while you lap. After you have it in a staple form, you can lap those final edges over and do the actual final closure. This is a really cool and challenging forging. It's fun to do, and you might not get it on the first time, but it'll really challenge your skill set, and I would recommend you try it. It's in Mark's second book. Here's the page number, 344. It's handy for some applications. It's not applicable to all applications. You might find that depending on what you're putting together, this might not work, but there are a lot of instances where it really makes the job easier. So this is good to have. You could also fabricate one of those up. Now, this is the collaring jig that I have for my level 3. So I have a gap here and a gap here. That accounts for the bead on my beaded collar. But if you were to basically, let me switch back to this, basically do a different version of this with no gap, you could substitute this, just having this whole section solid, and basically substitute your filing vise using a spring vise like this. And this section down here, you can set this up so that you bend your staple shape here using a spring vise. So it's kind of an all-in-one tool. I didn't have one of those because that's not what I've used, but you could put together a spring vise that does both your jig and mandrel that I just showed and your spring vise all in an individual spring vise that you made for this particular job. And that is really handy to have. Then you're going to make some test elements, and the test elements are basically 2 curved elements with a blind rivet. So if you're going to do this, you could freehand this you could do this freehand over a horn with a hand hammer, or you could do it with a couple of different scrolling wrenches. But my recommendation would be that you make a scrolling jig and use a scrolling wrench to do that. Collars, this is a good time to introduce the idea that collars are not a structural element. They're more of a decorative element. They do add some structural aspects to your grille or railing or whatever, but not enough to cover a long span. So what really adds the structure is the blind rivet, and then the collar covers the junction between the two different scroll elements and covers your rivet. So a lot of this comes down to being a decorative kind of thing. And what you want to do is you want to approximate your elements for the grill. In this case, I have 3/8 by 3/4 coming together where I would have my S scrolls. They don't match the scroll profile, but they give me the cross section I need to practice my collaring. And you want to do a number of practice pieces until you're confident that your measurement and your process is good, and you dial that all in so that you can do that on your grill, because you have a lot into that grill and you don't want to mess up. You could always cut something off, but it's really stressful. So you want to really feel confident that when you apply that collar, it's going to be good, it's going to be set, and you're going to be able to move on and have a complete piece. And to have that confidence, you want to have these scroll fragments, and you want to do testing and practice a little bit. So this is a basic scrolling jig. This is actually the scrolling jig that is for the centerpiece of my level 3 grill to do the center elements where they all come together. But I use this for these scroll fragments. You're basically going to transfer your hot piece of work onto. I put a mark over here so that I had it consistent to a consistent bend. So I put a chalk mark over there. I transfer the hot piece over to a pair of tongs, which accounts for the 1/4 inch plus the 3/8. Closest thing I had was 7/16, and it worked really well. I had a pair of 7/16 inch flat jaws. I pin it, and then I'm going to wrap it around with my scrolling wrench. And that's what this looks like in this video. So I bring the hot piece of stock out. I'm going to grab it with my pair of flat jaw tongs. I'm going to switch from my tongs to a scrolling wrench, and I'm going to scroll that around, and now I can reproduce these scrolling elements enough that I can put these practice fragments together. And I didn't go through the tedium of putting these all together, because really putting these together is finding where the two elements touch and marking off with with chalk, and then drilling a hole that is sized to your rivet stock, and using a transfer punch. After you've done your first hole, you transfer punch over to the first or over to the second element. You make sure that your hole alignment is good. And then for a blind rivet, you countersink, and you really only need about a 1/16 of an inch to either side proud of that stock. So another way to put it is you have about an 1/8 inch longer rivet than your total bundle. In this case, that would be 7/8. And that 1/16 of an inch is enough to fill your countersink, and you can make your scroll elements like that. And I didn't think that needed to be covered. I wanted to, in a video, I basically just figured I could cover that verbally. So now, using this jig and mandrel, the spacing, as I said, is set for the bundle plus the collar stock. The bundle isn't changing on this, but the collar stock is changing. So I have two different sizes, one for 3/16 and one for 1/4. And you got to remember that that's doubled because it's hitting all edges. And again, you take your total bundle plus your total collar stock, add a shim for thermal expansion, and then clamp that together and weld. The stop here, because I didn't explain that, what that is to keep the collaring stock, when you put this up to drive your driver, your mandrel here, it's to keep the stock square to these uprights. Because if you have one kind of hanging out over here and another one up against this stop, for instance, you're going to have your collaring stock driven in at an angle, and that's not going to set down on your element when you go to collar it. So these stops are really just for a quick reference, because you have a limited amount of time. You've got this up to heat. You can push it up against the stock and make sure that it's going to be a square forging when you're done. And that's really all those are for. Then you're going to bend that into a U shape, and you can see in this case that mine didn't quite end up completely flush at the top. But what I did was when I drove my collar on, I drove the shorter side first, and then I took this sort of extra length and I kind of jammed it into the space. So you can work with that. You just need to be strategic. Then you're going to take this staple shape and you're going to put your element, whether it's the scroll or whether this is the a fragment like we're doing for the practice. You're going to put that into your collaring vise. So you're going to have your collaring vise set with the jaw spacing on your vise enough to accommodate both the collaring stock and everything. In other words, you have a little bit of slack there. You drop the hot staple in, you drop your scroll elements or your fragment in, you tighten down on your vise and squeeze these, and then you're going to come in with a set hammer or a rawhide mallet. I prefer a set hammer on a plain collar. On an incised collar or a beaded collar, I prefer a rawhide mallet because I'm trying to protect the decoration that I put onto that. So in this case, this is a plain collar, so I'm using a set hammer, and you can see the radius, the radii on my edges is pretty generous, and I'm not going to put edge marking on my work. So here we go with the video of that. I'm bringing out my stock. I'm going to repeat. I cut it to about 3 3/8, but 3 7/16 might be good depending on how your tooling works, your frame of reference for cutting, etc. You're going to put it into the jig and drive down with the mandrel. You can see I'm pushing it against the stops to keep everything square, and I'm going to drive that all down. And then you can see the welding bead I should have ground off prior to the video because it tends to get stuck. So anything on the edge is going to bind. From here, you can see the staple shape that I have. That is going to get changed out for a collaring vise. I'm going to bring the hot staple in. I'm going to bring the scroll element down, position it so that it's over my blind rivet, tighten my vise, and then now I'm going to use my set hammer, and you'll notice that I change my angle as I go. And then you can see that one came up flush. This one ended up being slightly long, but I jammed it into that space, and by the time I set it down, everything came up where it should. There was a slight twist, so what I'm adjusting here is the alignment of these edges that was off from the twist, and you can see I have a good closure. Now, collars, I should mention, the integrity for your collar comes from the fact that you essentially get a shrink fit because you have thermal expansion while the piece is hot. If you get it to an exact fit and that ends up being, who knows? There are some engineers in the group, they could probably tell you, but say a fraction of an inch is going to shrink onto that. And then by the time it shrinks onto a cold element, it really ends up very tight and very secure. Now we're going to talk about incising. Incising is basically what we would ask for you to do if you were going to go off of the earlier plans that had this swaged 3 beaded collar on the plans. You don't need to go through the beaded collar where you're driving a piece of stock down into a swage and making a swaged piece of stock for a collar. You can incise in here and you get a similar profile, and truly doing a beaded collar is more appropriate for level 3 than for level 2. You can do it if you'd like. It's not going to be covered in this discussion. I would steer you towards doing the incised collar or a upset forged collar, upset cornered forged collar. Now, if you're eyeballing this, which I do in the video, you're going to use, I tilt my tool so that I can sight right down this edge and I can see the edge of my hot cut. I'm going to reference off of my edge of my hot cut to the edge of the steel, and I want that to be about 1/4 of an inch. Then I'm going to tilt in the other direction and reference off the other edge to the other edge and try to get 3 incisions that are a 1/4 of an inch a piece. Now that's kind of easier said than done, especially when you're juggling everything and it's at heat. Might help if you have a lot of experience to do that without any kind of marking out. If you're gonna do that while it's hot, I would make sure that you're really referencing off of the edge of the tool to the edge of the stock with equal divisions of stock. Now, if you're not really confident, I would recommend that you mark it cold like I did here. And I would recommend further that you would use, say, a combo square where you measure out, say, a 1/4 of an inch and scribe off of one edge for a 1/4 and then scribe off of the other edge. I would recommend scribing because when you cold chisel, sometimes you blow off the scale and you'll lose your mark, but a scribed line will stay and you can mark out cold. And if you're going to mark out cold, I would recommend that you mark deeply enough that you aren't going to lose your mark in the fire and that your tool will drop down into your incision line without having to look for it so that you can do an actual incising at temperature. So you'll also, see that I did this hot. I was eyeballing it. This is all, at temperature without any previously scribed lines. And you'll see that my lines wander a little bit. And I'm going to toggle back and forth between these frames for a second. You can see that this one veers in here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit at an angle and I'm going to steer my line over from where it veers before I commit to it. So this is marking out. And then after I mark out, then I'm going to drive an actual incised line after I'm satisfied with my marking out. When I did it at heat, I needed to make adjustments as I went. So it veered and then I angled to correct for that veering. And you can see that in the video here in a second. After you've gotten your incised lines, you're going to bevel your end. In this case, I did a beveled wrap. So you're going to bevel your end with a very upright taper. And then you can cut off with a hot cut to make your other taper. You can see this taper and this taper are on opposite edges so that by the time they wrap, they overlap. We'll talk about that a little bit more. That gives you a staple that looks like this. And then when you use I used a rawhide mallet, you can see me hit this lap first because this lap needs to lap on top, and you can really aggravate yourself quite a bit by doing that in reverse because you'll have to cut your collar off. You could also use a set hammer as I showed earlier, and that is fine, but you might get a little bit of distortion on your incised line. Either way, it doesn't matter if I use a set hammer or a mallet. I always come back over my incised lines with a hot cut when I'm done to bring the two lapped ends, the incised lines, to bring them together. So you'll see that in the video. Okay, so we have the collaring stock. I'm gonna trap it between my legs. I'm gonna reference off of the edge of my stock to the edge of the edge of the tool to the edge of the stock, and now I'm referencing off the edge of the tool to the edge of my previous incised line. And then you can see I'm keeping the toe of my tool in my incised line, and then before I strike, I drop to be flush with the stock so that I can walk my incised line down. So after I get a little bit of length on that, then I'm gonna try to complete the next one. You'll see when my stock becomes very cool, I get a lot more chatter because my tool isn't sinking. So I really just need to take a heat so that that tool can sink into the stock. If your stock is cold, the tool is going to want to jump back out of it. And you can see that my line wavers a little bit. So now you can see as I get into the area that deviated off of center, I angle a little bit to make a correction. And I do that until I have gone past, say, I know I need at least, say, 3.5 inches of this to be able to make my collar stock. So anyway, I'm going to continue with my incising until I get to the depth that I want. I'm going to do a very upright taper, check my stock back, and then continue to taper. I want something that I can match with my hot cut. I'm going to take my measurement. Now I'm going to pause for just a second so we can talk about this. My measurement has to include the length of this overlap, because now the overlap has to lap over the other side. You really only need to measure for one overlap. So I was measuring 3 3/8. The length of my bevel is about 3/16. So I added that to my measurement and I cut from the back side. You can see my bevel here is down and my next bevel needs to be on the opposing edge. And if I don't do that, it won't overlap. So I've added the total length together and I take that measurement and then I make my first cut. You can approach this in multiple ways. You can take your original stock of 3 3/8 or 3 7/16. You can cut it square and you can do opposing overlaps with your hammer. You'll end up at the correct length that way. You can go off of a cut edge and then measure back, or you can bevel and measure back. But if you're going to measure back, there's 2 ways you can approach it. You can go off of this edge, add the length of your bevel to your measurement, or you can go to the end of the bevel, not this end, but the side that is where the bevel terminates up into the incise line. You can measure off of that and measure your true measurement. So depending on which side of the bevel you're measuring off of, you can either take the true measurement off of the termination of your taper, and then after you've done that, you'll have to flip it over, draw your line, and then cut from there. Or you can add the length of the taper to your measurement and get your line from there. It really doesn't matter which way you choose. Just make sure that you have an idea of what you're doing when you do this process. So I have opted to measure from the actual end, add my bevel, take my measurement, and cut. Now you can see that I'm actually angling the hot cut back towards myself, so I accentuate this bevel. Then after I've cut nearly through, I'm going to take it to an edge and I'm going to shear it off of that edge. This gives me a controlled cut. This is good for any hot cutting operation, because then I can wring that off and I don't have my hot cut piece of stock sailing through the air. After this, it's the same process. Line up so you have an equal amount of stick outs, we might call it, on each side of your jig. Drive down with your mandrel and get your staple. You can see that my hot cut kind of deformed some of my incised lines. That's fine, because I'm going to come down. I'm going to clamp with my spring vise. I'm going to use a mallet to bring the bevel with the top side of the bevel down first, and then the underside bevel second. I'm going to use my set hammer and I'm going to push the material up towards that junction, and then I'm going to flush everything out. Everything looked really good on this, but there was just a little spot that kind of fell away right there where I must have forged it a little unevenly. Now I'm going to connect my lines from one incision to the other so that they're actually truly connected. And anytime I do that kind of work, I usually come back with a set for cleaning. Now you can see this end has a little bit where that bevel rolls off, but I'm going to present this to the camera and you can see my closure there is really pretty good. So I know I have my measurement right, but maybe my forging, I maybe favored this side over here and over forged a little bit there. These are the kind of things that you're looking for when you're doing your own test pieces. The final option that we're going to talk about for this particular level of the curriculum is the wrapped and forged collar. You're going to start with 1/4 by 3/4 flat bar. The additional 1/16 of thickness on this stock gives you enough to forge your corners in, but ultimately you end up at a 3/16 inch thickness collar. So the additional is to get the material into the corners. What that means is you're going to use the same measurement as you had. I had been using 3 3/8. That was the measurement that worked for me. 3 and 7/16 is kind of what the math comes out to. You figure out what works for you. So you cut the same measurement. You're going to wrap around a mandrel. The mandrel is basically either a bundle of the total bundle of elements for your collaring, or in this case, my bundle was 3/8 doubled by 3/4, so it ends up 3/4 square. And I made a mandrel that just has a little bit of a taper so that I can drive the collar off after forging. And I do want to mention that this goes a little bit through an ugly stage, because as you're wrapping this by hand, this doesn't quite go around completely square. Now, I will say that rather than wrapping it by hand as I did in this video, you could put that into the scrolling vise and you can hammer that over as I did with the set hammer or the mallet, and you could avoid this sort of ugly stage if you did that. You can see the vise, or I'm sorry, the tongs that I have are going to trap my mandrel in, and I like to have a tong ring on there because that way I don't need to worry about the whole arrangement. I can focus on my forging. You're going to wrap that around. You'll notice you have a little bit of a gap, and that's because the total length isn't totally appropriate for this stock yet, because these corners are rolled off. You're going to gain some length as you go, and that will fill that little bit of a gap. So a little bit of a gap is desirable, because if these things butt up at the start, your collar's too big, and when you go to upset everything, you're just going to be making a big collar that isn't completely on your mandrel the whole time. It won't fit your elements. Now, when you're working on this, you need to focus on your corners, because if you forge these flat edges here, you're going to elongate your collar stock, and you're going to make it too big for your elements. It'll overshoot the size of the mandrel, which means it overshoots the size of the elements. You can see my angled blows are kind of coming towards these corners because I'm really focusing on hitting right down this column on each side to pack material into these corners. And you can see in this frame why it's important that you have a butted edge, because I need to have support under my upsetting blow so that the material can be packed into these corners. So I'm going to work where I'm doing slightly angled blows on each corner until I get the corner done. Then I'm going to use an overlapping hammer blow pattern across my mandrel to bring it to a uniform thickness. When I'm done with that, I'm going to use some scrolling tongs, and I'm going to take my forged mandrel and open it up. Now, this is where you might run into problems. If you haven't dressed your mandrel well, you'll have a sharp corner on the interior corner of your collar. And when you open it, you will have a stress riser open up, because you will have a cold shut in here because you had too sharp of an interior corner, as indicated by my center punch. Oops. So you can see, and this is very, very informative, because you might be pulling your hair out if you don't know why this is happening. I used an undressed mandrel for the first picture to show how this is going to be a problem. And then this mandrel, you can see this is the same collar. I didn't take a picture of the next collar, but it didn't have these cracks. And the reason is because I radiused my mandrel off so that I don't have a very sharp corner in the interior corners of my collar before I forge it. It's when you're forging over a sharp interior corner that you get your cold shut, and that's where you're going to create a stress riser that when you open it up, you're going to have a crack in your collar. You avoid that by having this radiused edge. You're going to open it wide enough that your test element or your scroll element can fit inside the gap, and you're going to test that as you go. And then from there, you're going to close this with a pair of bolt tongs as shown. And I like to go back to my collaring vise and finish everything with a set hammer. You'll really see that close up in the video here in a second. So we're going to use the same arrangement. You have a jig and a mandrel, but now you're using 1/4 inch stock. So you have a jig and a mandrel that's set up wider. I should say that this particular jig and mandrel demonstration is still the 3/16 inch quarter stock or collar stock, because the one that I did on on the 1/4 inch, it was just bad video. So I used the better video, but you're going to use a larger jig to accommodate the larger stock. So you're going to set that up. You're going to drive your mandrel into the jig, keep everything square against the stops, and you're going to make the staple shape. Again, you would avoid that binding if you were to, remove the welding. Now I have my mandrel here, which I'm going to forge around. You can see it gets a little wonky, so I have to drive the mandrel down. And you could avoid this wonkiness by using your collaring vise and either a set hammer. I would recommend a set hammer, but you could use a mallet. But at any rate, you can just sort of, manhandle that thing around and get it around your mandrel. Again, I want to point out your mandrel, you can see here, also has radiused edges. You have a jig and mandrel to drive the staple shape. Now you're forging over a mandrel here. Those have to be radiused as well, so you don't propagate a stress riser. So now I've pulled that, I've got it wrapped around. Now I'm going to forge my corners. So I get it onto the mandrel, and you can see I'm hitting the corners. So I'll go from one side to the other side, and I'll work back and forth, and I'm trying to upset right down that column of stock to get a square corner. My priority here is to have a square corner. Now, once I've got a square corner, now I'm going to use overlapping blows, and I'm going to get stock thickness uniformity. I'm going to work right down those edges. And as I go, that gap will continue to close, and I'll end up with my 3/16 inch thickness and square corners. I'm going to take my scrolling tongs and open it up. I go halfway and I flip it because my stock will not open evenly. You'll see the gap was greater on the side that was open first. So by flipping it, I make the opening parallel, and I check to make sure that my element will fit. My element will fit, so I set it down in hot. I'm going to use some bolt tongs to close it. I'm going to take the whole arrangement over to my vise, set it in the vise. This was still a little proud, so I had to kind of coax it in, close it, and you can see that last closure with this vise really benefited from using that vise. And now I can really get that last little bit with my set hammer. And again, this is sort of a shrink fit. So by the time that's all done, this is going to close down really hard on that scroll element. So the last thing that should be mentioned, because I mentioned it previously, is that you can do a beaded collar. This is level 3. I'm not trying to suggest that you should do this, but I'm not trying to discourage you from doing it either. What I do want to make you aware of is that each one of these sets, you can see this is a 1/4 inch bead with a 1/4 inch swage with a 1/4 inch top tool. That's one set that also has its own jigs, mandrels, spring vices, everything for that one collar. And this is a separate collar with a 1/2 inch that also has the original swage, the complex swage, a top tool. And this one that I did for my level 2 that has 3 beads, I had a master positive, a master negative, and then a master negative swage. The reason why I'm pointing this out is I'm not trying to discourage you from doing it. I want to make you aware that it's a lot more commitment. It's a lot it's a much more advanced skill set. There are a lot of tools that need to be made to do that. So if you're going to decide to do a beaded collar, you need to be aware of the commitment in time, tooling, etc., to be able to do that. So it's beyond the scope of the level two. It does take a lot of tooling. And the commitment there is definitely worth it. It's worth the challenge. There's a lot of opportunity for design there, but this just really isn't a level two thing. This is more of a level three thing. So I wanted to touch on it, but it's beyond the scope of the project. So that sort of really wraps up, so to speak, no pun intended, collars.